Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to be talking about probably the most unoptimized game to have ever released. This is Ark Survival Ascended, and it is an Unreal Engine 5 game. It is a visual remake of the original Ark Survival Evolved, and sure, we're running at 71 frames per second, so what exactly is so terrible about that? Well, let me just show you I'll go over the specs quickly. We are running with the 7800 X3D CPU with an RTX 4090 and then also DDR5 6000 megatransfers per second CL30 memory with some tuned subtimings from Buildzoid. Now 60-ish frames per second here. We are running at 1440p epic, and we do have DLA enabled, no DLSS, right? So this is just native resolution with the anti-aliasing tech of DLSS and epic preset, and it does say that the epic preset is recommended for 4070 and up. So why is this so terrible? First off, we have forced frame generation in this game. You can see that the frame time graph is extremely all over the place, and that dinosaur is quite aggressive. And you can see that our lows aren't really that good. It's actually a little bit better than my previous recording, but we are getting 70 frames per second here at native resolution with a 4090, almost at 4070. But the issue is that frame generation is forced, and we do get a lot of stuttering. And with 70 frames per second final output frame rate, we are getting a lot of latency. Another issue is also, if you have a look at the top right hand corner there, we seem to be very CPU limited. Our GPU usage is only sitting at between 70 and 80%. And also PC latency average shows as 0 milliseconds. So even though we do, oops, that's the wrong button. Even though we do have frame generation enabled here, which we can't disable, reflex is not enabled. Okay, and that is also, that can be proven by enabling VSync, and on this 60 Hz capture card, it locks the frame rate to 60 frames per second instead of 57, which you would get when you actually have reflex enabled. Alright, so 70-ish frames per second here, CPU bound, frame time graph all over the place, latency terrible, visuals pretty good, I'm not going to lie, it really does look good, except for the shadows. Just look at the tree there. As the tree moves, how the shadows update on the tree. I'm not sure if there's actually anything that can be done to fix this, but you can see that it is dynamic shadows as the trees move. We also do have dynamic lighting, so as the sun moves across the sky, we will see updates to the lighting, and I believe that basically exacerbates the issue a bit. All right, so 60 something frames per second here. I'm going to show you what you can actually do to improve the performance quite a bit. So all you have to do is you open the console using the tilde key. That's the key just below escape. You can type in r.volumetric cloud 0 like this. All right, this will get rid of all volumetric clouds. Now we went from around 60 frames per second to 70-ish frames per second, so a slight increase to our frame rate. And I don't know if you noticed, something weird was happening there. If you go into the menu or if you open the console commands, frame generation deactivates and you actually get the real frame rate. But now I can see that the frame time graph is smoothed out for some reason. You move around a bit and there's a stutter, and then the frame time graph becomes extremely inconsistent again. Now just look as I open the console here. You can see that the frame time graph smooths out and our frame rate goes to 47. So basically we are getting 47 frames per second without frame generation here, and that's why the input latency is just so horrible. All right, so let's see, can DLSS settings actually make a difference here for us? I'm going to leave volumetric clouds disabled for now. So let's just go with DLSS quality quickly, and if we go back to our game, we didn't really not gain that much. We were seeing around 70, between 70 and 80 frames per second, right? And now we're still seeing 70 to 80 frames per second here. Our GPU usage dropped quite a bit. So that would indicate a CPU bottleneck. Look at our GPU power, 145 watts, right? That's out of the 450 watt that this GPU can use. I'm using 100% power limit. We are using 147 watts. This is... and that's what I mean by completely unoptimized. it just does not utilize whichever components you throw at it. And even at 4K, we are CPU limited, which I will show you after the 1440p results. So we might not see improvements to our frame rate, so 77-ish frames per second there. I just want to test with the balance quickly, see if we actually do get a bit of a bump to our frame rate. So 77, that becomes, let's just let it normalize, around 80-ish frames per second. 70, so it goes down all the so we definitely CPU limited, yeah. And funny enough, even though we are CPU limited, I do think that the performance preset does not make a difference, but ultra performance actually does. So 80 frames per second there. So let's just go with it's over here, ultra performance, right? So this would be 540p upscale to 1440p. Let's just see. So we gained a little bit. We went from around, what was it, just over 80 to around 90-ish. And now all of a sudden our frame time graph is a lot smoother. It just goes haywire in movement. But if we stand stuck, I'm like, this, it's really a very, very terrible game. But now the issue is that, sure, if you do get 80-ish frames per second, input latency is still pretty bad. But if we then enable volumetric clouds, it's r.volumetric cloud, and we say 1. So just look at some of the cloud detail here. I'm not sure if we actually do have the correct clouds to show you here. There we go. Let me just get past that tree. You can see the shimmering in all the clouds here. And this only happens when you actually start using aggressive upscaling, and only at certain spots. So and now the shimmering is gone, right? But this does happen quite a bit on aggressive upscaling. So it really is kind of horrible. Sure, we are on the Epic preset, right? So let's go ahead. We're 80-ish frames per second here. I'm going to just go back to DLSS quality, right? So just going to get a baseline performance here again. And as you can see, still 80-ish frames per second. All right, so our GPU power is still at 143, 140, whatever. Okay, so 70-ish frames per second in this specific spot. So we're just going to do some preset testing. So let's go to the high preset in the specific spot. Remember, 70-ish frames per second. Let's go back. And now I'm just going to get rid of the lows there. 70, 80. Right, let's just let it stabilize. So, right, fine. We gained 10-ish frames per second, right? Remember, volumetric clouds are enabled. All right, so then if we drop this down to the medium preset, sorry, I moved the camera around a bit. Let me just open up the overlay again. We are seeing 115 frames per second, definitely much better. I just want to move the camera to feel input latency. It feels better. This is a little bit better, but it still feels like there's duplication of frames happening, similar to what happened with Avatar in with its FSR3 Frame Generation implementation. All right, so then if we drop this down to low, we have to go back into the main menu to apply the changes. So we'll do that and come back. Remember, 112 frames per second, give or take. All right, and here we are back, and now it changed from 112 frames per second to 180 frames per second. So, okay, the colors, everything look a lot more muted, a lot less saturated in certain lighting conditions, I must say. And one thing that I did notice is that terrain detail stops loading, right? So some geometry does not load in. I believe that these nanite objects here, they were supposed to be lying on a rock, which they are no longer doing. And then also one other thing is, if you this is the weirdest, if you actually move closer to objects, they start to disappear. Look at some of the grass objects, the foliage, they start disappearing the closer you get to them, which is extremely weird. It's not that they start rendering in higher detail, that's the pop in. You can just see there's quite a few leaves there and then no leaves, right? So it really is very strange. This game is extremely poorly optimized. It's I don't know, I really do regret actually spending money on this game. I thought it would be a pretty good visual upgrade over Ark Survival evolved, and it was, but none of my friends can play it with me because because of the poor performance, right? But you can just see that the nanite objects here definitely are just resting in the air. You can't interact with them. I did try that earlier. It's just it's basically textures, right? It's not actual objects in the real world, and you can just see that nothing is working as it should on the low preset, and the foliage disappearing is the weirdest for me. But we do get 100 and something, 150, 180 frames per second on the low preset. So if you do want a playable experience when it comes to frame rate, then unfortunately this is your only setting that you can use. And strangely enough, our GPU usage is actually sitting at 240 watt now on the low pre. I don't know, the weird things are happening here with this game. All right, so let me just see what changes volumetric fog makes here. So 168 frames per second here. So let's disable volumetric clouds again. Now it does disable volumetric fog as well. So 160 something frames per second becomes 172 frames per second. I do think there's something wrong now. I did see a much higher frame rate earlier when I changed that, but you can now see the frame time graph looks even worse. But now moving the camera, that really does feel terrible. All right, so I think that's going to be it for 1440p. Before I switch to 4K, I actually did a previous recording where I enabled VSync on this 165 hertz panel, and I did a local recording just to show you that the inconsistent frame times and the frame time graph it's actually a little bit better when you run into your VSync limit. So if you enable VSync, it does run a little bit better if you can actually maintain that. All right, I'm going to do 1 or 2 tests here at 4K. So let me change the settings back to where they were. So here we are at 4K on the Epic preset, and this is horrible. Motion blur. I don't know, the frame persistence in this game is terrible. When I move the camera, it does not even feel like 40 frames per second. It looks like 10 frames per second. Sure, motion blur is enabled, but it's really not supposed to cause the frames to be as persistent as they are. And I would just attribute that to the way the frames are presented. So I think this might be a custom frame generation solution, or it might be FSR frame generation, because as I said, it's definitely not DLSS frame generation because reflex is not enabled. And I think they implemented something that works with all GPUs because it needs to work with all GPUs because the game's performance is horrible. I'll be very surprised if it is actually DLSS frame generation. I know previously before when we actually had the option, it was DLSS 3 frame generation, but I'm not sure what it is now. Anyway, so these dinosaurs are really aggressive, but I think I'm strong. There we go. All right, so 40-ish frames per second here. Terrible experience. Let's do some DLSS scaling. So 40, we're getting 30 without frame gen. Okay, so DLSS quality, let's see if that improves our frame rate a bit. Actually it does, but just look at it now. So the frame time graph is quite smooth, and then it starts. Right now you can see that the frame times are very inconsistent. The frame rate drops. We went from 75 to 66. So something is not playing well with this game here at all. Right, so 67, let's call it 70 frames per second. I'm going to close that. Let's just try a few DLSS presets here. So 67, 70 frames per second, right, with DLSS quality. And then with this, let's just give it some time to normalize. 74-ish frames per second, and just look at the clouds. If you look at it at a certain angle, it starts to shimmer now. So 74 frames per second DLSS balanced. And then if we go to performance, we'll go to ultra performance as well, although I would not recommend it. We are seeing, we're not really seeing that big a difference going from quality all the way to where we are now, right? So 81 frames per second, and that was with DLSS performance. So this is actually 1080p internal render resolution. So let's go with ultra performance. Let's see. I think this is the only one that really shows a little bit of a decent performance uplift. Not performance uplift, you know, that you just lessen the burden of the GPU by rendering internally at a lower resolution. But just look at the clouds now, shimmering quite a lot. And this does happen in quite a few games with DLSS where there's these detailed volumetric clouds, right? So DLSS ultra performance, 100-ish frames per second. And I'm a little bit jittery. So let's go ahead and just disable volumetric clouds again. I want to see at 4K if it makes a bit of a difference. And oops, that's wrong button. So we gained around 20-ish frames per second, right? Who's attacking me now? See, I had reason to be paranoid. So 120-ish frames per second. It feels much, much better. The higher your final frame rate output is, the better it feels when you've got frame generation enabled, obviously. And this is actually pretty decent. Well, this is 720p internal render resolution for ultra performance, right? It's not something that I would personally recommend. So that was it for the resolution scaling. So I'm going to go back to DLSS quality, and then we'll do some preset scanning as well. Right, so we're back with DLSS quality. Volumetric clouds are enabled again, and we're getting around 60-ish frames per second here. So let's see, 60, that was 66 round about there. So let's go with the high preset. I'm going to try and do this one a little bit more quick. If it loads, let's see. All right, so 66 becomes 77. Let's just wait for it. There we go. All right, 66 becomes 68 on the high preset. Then if we go to the medium preset, once again, the low preset will probably be the only one worth it when it comes to performance, but then it's also the only one not worth it when it comes to visuals. So 76 frames per second. You can see that everything takes so long to load in. Even if we do have an RTX 4090 with 24 gigabytes of VRAM, it really is terrible. Do not spend money on this game. I think it is available on Game Pass. If you do have a Game Pass subscription, just play it there, if at all. I'd personally not recommend this game at all, even for free. All right, so 77 frames per second there. And we're going to drop this down to the low preset, and going back into the main menu quickly to apply the changes. I'll be right back. All right, and there we have the low preset. We are getting 105 frames per second. Textures are non-existent. They haven't loaded in yet. There we go. No, they're not. Oh, come on. This is horrible. This is so terrible. I can't believe that they actually do charge you quite a high price for this game as well. And it's just broken. Nobody can play it unless you have a 4090 and want to play on the low preset. And then even then, it's just riddled with all these visual anomalies and issues. It's just not worth it at all. Once again, low preset, the geometry does not load incorrectly, and we have floating rocks. And I don't know, this is really horrible. Let's just actually see what the best frame rate is we can get on the system. So I'm going to disable volumetric clouds again, right? So 141 frames per second. We actually saw a nice increase to our frame rate there. And then I'm going to, we're on the low preset, right? So let's do DLSS ultra performance on the low preset without volumetric clouds. Let's see. And it breaks. Like you can just see, actually it feels a lot more responsive, almost like frame generation disables above a certain, because it feels above a certain frame rate. Sorry, let me just finish my thought. Because it feels extremely responsive now, and we're not seeing that excessively thick line. We actually do see some gaps in the frames there. I do think that frame generation gets disabled. Maybe it's one of those auto frame generation settings. I don't know. It's weird. So you can just look here. Everything is just a broken mess on these settings. So even if you do aim to maximize your 165 Hertz panel, Like the visual sacrifices you have to make to get there is just not worth it to me, in my opinion anyway. All right, I think that's going to be the end of this video. I just wanted to show you what I personally believe to be the worst optimized game to release ever looks like, what it performs like, and then also just to warn you. But I do hope that they get their act together for the release of Arc 2. I got no idea when that is actually releasing, but I really do hope that it does launch in a much better state than what this game is. Remember, this game is now a year and 2 months old, so it's not like these are still launch issues. It's had some time, but it's just not fixed. All right, so enough of me complaining. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.